Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about small solar generators. And I've been offered to review quite a few of these, and I said no up until now, but this PAX-S unit seemed really interesting. If you're looking for a Yeti 150 or 200X, this thing offers a much better display, a beefier inverter, and even a larger battery at a much lower price. So I offered to give it a review. And this arrived in good shape, nicely packaged, and is incredibly light. And around front there is a 12-volt auto port, 2 barrel connectors, 3 USB-A outputs, and one of those is a USB 3 quick charge, a USB-C, that's power delivery, so you can also use it to charge the unit or charge a device at 30 watts. And on the side is a single AC plug capable of 200 watts continuous, 300 watts peak. On the other side is just a fan vent. And looking around back, it's a pretty simple plastic back. There is a green plastic handle on the top. Overall fit and finish is pretty solid, nothing to write home about, definitely not Goal Zero quality. And looking at the label on the bottom, this is a 230 watt hour battery, which is pretty significant for the weight. Let's see what you get in the box. So first of all, it comes with an instruction manual and warranty card. This thing has an 18-month warranty. Goal Zero has a 2-year warranty. But again, remember you're paying about half the cost for this thing. This has a auto charging cable, which is great to have that included in the box. And that will charge this unit at 30 watts. And then lastly, there's a wall plug, and this wall plug is also rated at 30 watts of output. So let's go ahead and fire this thing up. We'll plug it into the wall, see how it does. There we go. So one of the reasons why I actually wanted to look at this unit is that the display is great. It actually shows you the input and output watts, which is fantastic. And I think the selection of ports on the front is really good. It has pretty much anything you'd need. My old Yeti and even my Yeti 1000 doesn't have USB-C, so it's really been fun to have that. Now, this thing will let you charge it and use any of the DC outputs at the same time. You can see here I'm using almost 60 watts of USB. However, you cannot use the AC at the same time. So I dug out my old Yeti 150 for comparison, so you can see how these things look side by side. And overall, I think the Yeti 150 is a bit bigger. You can see this is a lot narrower. And weight-wise, it's kind of crazy. This thing weighs 6.1 pounds, and the Yeti is an absolute beast. Because it's a lead-acid battery, this thing weighs over 11 pounds. And remember, this is 150 watt hours versus 230. Now, most of you are probably not looking at buying a Yeti 150. That's a pretty old unit. You're probably looking at the 200X. So let's compare these things. So the 200X, first of all, has oddly a really small battery. So it's less than 200 watt hours, which is kind of weird for their naming convention. So it's a significantly smaller battery. The USB-C output is twice as powerful, so it's 60 watts versus 30. The inverter, however, is much smaller. It's 120 watts versus 200 watts. So there are some trade-offs. The big thing that the Yeti 200X has on this is it can handle up to 100 watts of solar charging, which is really great because here we're limited to 30 watts. And speaking of solar charging, they sent along a 120 watt folding panel for me to test. They sell this as a kit. They also sell a kit with a 60 watt panel. And so I thought I'd give it a look. So inside the bag here, it comes with this adapter cable, and this has a number of different connectors on it that you can use to connect to various solar generators, including a Goal Zero 8mm plug. That's going to come in handy for me. And there's also a longer cord here that you can just use directly if you're plugging into this unit. All right, so let's see how this thing charges with solar. So setting up this 120 watt panel is really simple. It's very similar to the Rockpal 60 watt panel that I have. The only thing is the Velcro is insanely strong on this thing. It's a little over engineered, but once you get it unvelcroed, it's pretty easy to just unfold this and you're all ready to go. This also does include a kickstand, which I didn't use in this case, and you'll see why in a minute. Now inside there is this little junction box. The junction box has a USB-A quick charge as well as a USB-C, so that's really great. The cable is pretty beefy. It's a 16 gauge, but it feels pretty well insulated. And, you know, overall this panel seems really well made. I have no complaints about the quality. It's definitely heavy duty, and I think this will hold up. I think this has the ETFE style panel that I like. They're like the TP Solar style panels. There's definitely a lot more grid lines on this, but it seems to work really quite well. All right, so plugging it into the unit, well, I was a little surprised because I have a 120 watt panel on a sunny day, and well, I was getting 28, 29, 30 watts, and I was like, what is going on with this? And that's when I did look in the manual and I confirmed that you can only put 30 watts of power into this unit. So let's just say a 120 watt panel is overkill here. It does work within its rated specifications, but you definitely don't want a 120 watt panel here. I would strongly recommend getting a 50 or 60 watt panel. I think that would be pretty much the sweet spot. A 50 watt panel would allow you to have some headroom, so if it's a slightly cloudy day, it would still be hitting the max of 30 watts. So this is an example of the TP Solar 30 watt panel, just for reference. And here is the TP Solar 60 watt panel. And you can see how much smaller these are than the 120 watt panel. So, you know, I'm not saying you have to use that brand, but I would definitely stick with a 60 watt or smaller panel. If you want to stick with this brand, just get the 60 watt package. And remember, we have a 230 watt hour battery, and we're accepting up to 30 watts of charging power. So during the course of the day, I was able to take it from a very low number up to 60%, and that jibes with how things really work. So this would probably need 2 days to charge in the sun. All right, so I think really one of the main use cases for a solar generator of this size is for things like laptops and other USB devices. So what I wanted to do is give this a test with my 15-inch MacBook Pro, which is really a huge energy hog. And this ships from Apple with, I think, an 85 watt wall adapter. And right now the battery's at 99%, and I just have to turn on the USB. And by the way, these little buttons are a little hard to press, but I do appreciate that the lights are very small on them. And we're going to plug this into the USB and use the power delivery to hopefully deliver 30 watts or more to the MacBook. And I intentionally started this test with my MacBook Pro at 88%. So what I found with a lot of these USB chargers is they might be able to keep it limping along, but it actually can't make any forward progress. It can't charge the battery. So it's 1:13 right now. We're at 88%. And I use this throughout the day using things like Photoshop, really energy intensive applications. Normally this thing gets like 2.5 or 3 hours of battery life. It's pretty abysmal. But plugged into this box at 7:07, so about 6 hours later, not only did this thing charge it from 88 to 100%, but this thing still has 33% left in it. So I would say this is pretty much perfect if you wanted to be working off-site or at a cafe or something all day and know that you can keep your laptop going the entire time. You can get an 8 or 10 hour day out of this thing if you start off charged. All right, so another thing that you're going to use this device for is charging other USB devices. So what I figured I'd do is load this up and see how it goes. So this battery is pretty low because I just used it to run my MacBook Pro all day. But in addition to having that plugged in, I charge an iPhone and an iPad Pro. And, you know, just for fun, I thought I'd charge a Kindle as well. And with all 4 of these devices plugged in, this had no troubles at all. The fans did kick on. But considering how much it was outputting, which was close to 60 watts, no problems at all. So I would say for anything that's USB powered, including USB-C with power delivery, this thing works like a champ. So let's move on to something a little harder. Can this thing power a TV? Maybe even more? So what I wanted to do is test the AC output of this unit. And in my bedroom, I've got a pretty big TV. I think it's a 55-inch. I have a pair of small B&W powered speakers and an Apple TV. So this seemed like a fair test for this unit. And so what I wanted to do is just find out how long could this run a system like this? And can it run it at all? To accurately measure the power output and how many kilowatt hours we're using, I wanted to use this meter. And it doesn't unfortunately fit directly in, so I had to use an extension cord, but this kilowatt will give me a really accurate picture of what's going on. And after setting everything up, turning on the AC inverter, we're ready to run our test. And this unit was starting at 100%. And once I plugged it in, it was saying it was only using about 50 watts or so, but I think that's because the Apple TV hadn't booted up yet fully. And so once everything had really booted up, it was putting out, according to the unit, about 116 or 17 watts. However, when you look at it on the kilowatt, it was a little bit higher. So what that's telling me is that the wattage output here is telling you what's going on at the battery side of it, not what's going on at the AC outlet side of it. So since this is putting out close to 130 watts per hour, I would expect that a 230 watt hour battery would last maybe an hour and 45 minutes or so. And as this was working, the fans were really going on. So they were putting out about 55 dB of sound. So you can definitely hear this. I don't think these fans are any louder than the Goal Zero fans. They're probably quieter. But do recognize that if this thing is putting out significant power, the fans do have to kick on. And after an hour, we had used 120 watt hours, and the battery was at 39%. And so the thing was working great, slow and steady. And so everything was working as expected. And if we check in one more time, we can see where it's at. So at an hour and a half, and you remember, I'm predicting at about an hour and 45, this thing would die. At this point, we had put out 180 watt hours out of our 230. And at this stage, it started blinking. And so at 10%, it really cut out. So I think there is some minimum amount of battery power it needs to run the inverter. So the battery was not fully depleted, but it really couldn't handle putting out this much power when the battery is this low. But overall, I would say this thing performed really quite well. So for a really small solar generator, this thing can power fairly large electronics, just not for a very long amount of time. And one thing I wanted to test is whether or not this thing could safely handle an overload situation where I'm pulling too much power for the inverter. So I figured my Nespresso coffee machine might be perfect for this. This thing pulls about 800 watts, which is a lot more than the 300 watts this thing is rated for. So I went ahead and plugged it in, and it immediately did trip the safety protection on here, which is good. However, I think I was a little aggressive and I replugged it in and tried it a second time. And well, I think I broke it. What ended up happening is once I did that, it just wouldn't turn back on. I could plug it into the wall and it would turn back on. But as soon as I unplugged the AC charger from it, the thing would just shut off. So I reached out to the manufacturer. I told them the situation. They claim that it's probably just a defective unit, and they sent me a new one. So after a couple of weeks, I was back in business. But I would say be really careful with this unit. It does have a really small inverter, and I wouldn't go ahead and overload it too frequently because it might be a problem. All right, so one final test, the 12 volt. And I have this really large Dometic 75 dual zone fridge freezer. Both sides are set to be freezers, so they're basically as low as this almost goes. And this uses a fair amount of power. So I was curious, how long could this little tiny unit power a really big freezer like this? And fortunately, this has a regulated 12 volt plug, unlike my Goal Zero, so this thing should work fairly well. And so you can see by the time we get to 49% battery power, it's been running for 2 hours and 45 minutes. So not too bad. So based on this, it looks like it could run for about 5 hours. And so at 4.5 hours, I came and I checked on it, and I did notice that there was this low voltage warning. And I had set the low voltage cutoff on the fridge to the lowest it would go, but it did seem like once this thing reached this stage, it really just couldn't keep the voltage going. So the regulator works, but it doesn't work when the battery is super low. So once it hits about 25% battery power, I think the DC regulated output is dropping below a point where it's useful. But overall, I think this did a pretty good job. So how does this thing stack up? Well, I do think that for its primary use case, which would be running something like a CPAP machine for a few hours, or charging a laptop, or keeping a whole bunch of USB devices charged, or maybe running a small fridge for a short amount of time, this thing's pretty solid. And I think overall this is a much better value than either of the Goal Zero products. Definitely the 150, that's old technology, way too heavy. And the 200X is honestly just a lot of money and a smaller capacity. And for years I've been steering people away from these smaller solar generators, mostly because I would always say if you don't care about the inverter or the 12 volt output, just getting a handful of these USB battery packs is going to be less expensive. And so I have a couple of these Anker 26800 packs. So each one is 100 watt hours. So 2 of those are 200 watt hours. And then if you want to throw in a 20,000 milliamp hour, that's about 70 more watts. So that's 270 watt hours. But it's interesting, as I started looking up the current prices for these things, if you were to buy those 3 batteries, they'd pretty much be the same price as this unit. So it's beginning to change my mind about whether you should go with a generator like this. So if you want something small that will power a laptop, I actually think this is a better choice now. So this goes to show you how much cheaper batteries have gotten over the last couple of years, and really makes this a great value. So to wrap up, I think overall this is a really great unit. It has a really good display. It has all the ports you might need. It has a really powerful inverter for its size. And just keep in mind that there are limitations. Specifically, any generator of this size isn't going to be able to run a large appliance or any sort of high-draw appliance for any extended amount of time. I would say pair this up with a 60-watt panel and you'll be really happy. Let me know what you think in the comments. And thanks for watching.